facing a difficult situation, where do you look for help? Today on Truth for Life, Alistair Begg cautions us against placing our hope in anything other than God. Alistair is continuing our study of the life of Joseph as he is waiting in a dungeon, forgotten by the one person who promised to help him. Alistair has titled this message, Pharaoh's Dream.
The first phrase is the first phrase. Genesis 41:1, when 2 full years had passed. The point clearly is that Joseph was in this situation for a lot longer than he would ever have reckoned himself to be, or would have imagined that it was right for him to be. He was too long there for someone who had done nothing to deserve it. How about you? You ever had those kind of thoughts? That your life is nothing more than the stacking of 1 hour on top of another hour? That the girl who sits at the other desk, she has a life, but you'd like one. But for you, it's just routine. It's monotony. It's the same thing all the time, with no apparent human hope of change. You say to yourself, God, what are you doing with me? It is in the routine that the real gains are made, that the real joy is discovered, and that the reality of God's provision becomes most obvious. Do you know God in that way? Joseph did. Well, that's the first phrase I wanted to turn your attention to. Let's turn to the second one in verse 8. First of all, we notice this little phrase, 2 full years had passed, and we learned the importance of patience in the midst of monotony, and the understanding of the fact that God will give things as He chooses in His time, and in certain cases His time may involve us in waiting until eternity. Second phrase then is his mind was troubled. And in the morning, after he'd had these 2 striking dreams, his mind was troubled. Well, the dreams were troubling, were they not? We're told that we all dream a significant number of times in a week or in a night or whatever it is. I don't know, I'm no great expert on dreams. They say the average dream lasts about 30 seconds, although it would seem to me when I'm having one, it seems to last forever. I can't get out of it. And indeed, I was telling people earlier that one of our elders with whom I traveled to Bolivia used to had dreams that had lasted for years. And he was able to dream certain dreams at will when he went to bed at night. So he told me. And he's an honest man. Smart as well, PhD. Scared me to death. I wouldn't room with him. I was frightened of him. I asked for my own room. I didn't know what he was going to do in the middle of the night. He never asked me in the morning for an interpretation, thankfully. But these dreams were extraordinary dreams. These were, as in other dreams, a foreshadowing of God's intervention in the life of an unbeliever. Something stirring into this person's existence that awakened him in the morning with something a wee bit more than, that was a strange dream. The idea of these ugly cows eating the big, fat, sleek, shiny cows, that's bizarre. And corn, parched and fragmented and shriveled corn, eating really nice corn. I mean, imagine coming down to breakfast in the morning, telling your wife that. But he tells the people around him because he's got nobody else to tell. Cows and grain represented prosperity and security in Egypt. And he's troubled. He wakes up. And he wakes up concerned. And he looks around for help. And so like Humpty Dumpty, who's fallen off the wall, he sends for all his horses and all his king's men. In verse 8, the wise men, the magicians. And he told them his dreams. But what could they do? Nothing. Presumably all they did was look down at the floor in embarrassment, look around at one another shamefacedly, and finally look Pharaoh straight in the eye and say, I'm sorry, Pharaoh, you've stumped us on this one. Can I just say as an aside, all the magicians and wizards of the world are ultimately confronted with the poverty of their own explanations. And if you've been going to the wizards, if you've been following the 1-900 numbers, if you've been tempted to try and find an answer to why it is that you awaken troubled, I want you to know, in fact, I want to save you a lot of journeys. There are no answers to your predicament in those places. Because God said so. And Calvin, expressing this, says, the Lord so strikes the wicked workers of deceit that they cannot even find a specious explanation of the dreams. They can't even come up with a bogus explanation that the guy might swallow. Nothing. Pharaoh, in a subsequent era, might have found himself going through from his bedroom and grabbing a cup of coffee and turning on the radio and turning it to a nice, easy listening station like 104.1, you know. And drumming his fingers on the side of his coffee cup as the song makes its way. It's a long and a dusty road, and it's a hard and a heavy load, and people that I meet aren't always kind. Some are bad, and some are good, and some have done the best they could, and some try to ease my troubled mind, but I can't help but wonder where I'm bound, where I'm bound. I can't help but wonder where I'm bound. And the blankets that he was pulling over him could neither cover him in the night, nor snuggle him in the morning, nor save him from the tyranny of his own mind. And loved ones, this morning, it remains the same all these years later. If you are trying to make sense of your world by pulling, as it were, over you the blankets of materialism and intellectualism and hedonism, narcissism, a preoccupation with who you are and what you've got, if you are trying to cover yourself in those blankets, get ready for waking up regularly troubled. For those blankets are too short and they are too narrow. And alas, men and women seek to cover themselves in them all. It was a privilege to walk around Harvard University this week. I certainly felt like a fish out of water. But in an early morning stroll, I came across Emerson Hall. And across the entry to Emerson Hall, you have in letters carved in stone about a foot or 2 feet high, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" And I said to myself, my, at least it had a great beginning. As I was driving to the airport with a friend who had studied there, and I remarked on this, he said, it's an interesting thing. But when they built Emerson Hall, they left instructions to the stonemason to put across the entry, "Man is the summit of all things." And then they went on vacation. That was a tactical error. For the stonemason was a Christian. And he said, though they hang me for it, I'll put up here what needs to be up here. And he put up, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" Now you see, that is where a worldview begins, with that question. And then the correct answer to that question. And that, you see, was the fundamental question in the mind of Pharaoh. And that is the basic question in every mind. Who am I? Why do I exist? Is there meaning in my life? And what does my destiny hold? You say, well, this is a long, long way away from us. Well, let me give you a 20th century Pharaoh, shall I? Howard Hughes, as you may know, was brought up in the finest lifestyle in Massachusetts, private school, well-bred, clean fingernails, the whole bit. He knew the difference between a soup spoon and a teaspoon. At 18, his father died and left him a multimillionaire. He took the cash and hit Hollywood. By the time it was 1957, he had already created the coast-to-coast speed record in his plane. He'd crashed his plane, nearly killed himself. He had made at least one fortune. He had contracted syphilis, unidentified and untreated for a period of time without any kind of antibiotic intervention, which had a dramatic impact not only on his body physical but also on his neurological function. And in 1957, he decided one morning to begin a journey that was to last for the remainder of his life, some 18 years. And he had the people drive him to a studio lot in Hollywood and into a screening room. And he went into the screening room and he sat down. He didn't come out for the next 6 months. And the writer records how inside this dingy compound, Hughes headed straight for the screening room, a dark enclosure about the size of a studio apartment, and sitting in the middle of the room was his white leather recliner with a TV snack tray next to it. He lowered himself into the chair and arranged the Hershey bars in 7 little stacks. He looked them over, picked them all up again, and arranged them in 10 stacks. The piles were too high, he explained to his friend. Start the film. Hughes spent the night in the screening room. The next morning, the aides found him in the same chair, eating a breakfast of 6 Hershey bars and a half-pound of Texas pecans. Mr. Hughes, can we get anything for you? Howard continued to stare straight ahead. His aide pressed. Is there anything you need? Do you have instructions for us? Hughes wheeled around his chair. As long as I'm here, don't speak to me. Unless I ask you a question or make a comment, each morning and each evening you will bring me a fresh bag of half pecans, 10 Hershey bars, and a quart of milk. Don't speak to me when you deliver it. Just come over and stand next to me. When I ask you a question which requires a yes or no answer, do not speak. Just nod your head for yes, shake your head back and forth for no. Sometimes I will need to present you with more complicated questions. In that case, I will use a number 14 grease pencil and scrawl the question on one of my yellow legal pads. Once that is done, do not speak, just write the answer on one of your legal pads. By early March, more than 2 months after he'd entered, Howard's clothes were filthy, tearing at the seams. They reeked of urine. The white shirt was grey with grime and sweat, splotched by stains from the Hershey bars, and by the 3rd month, Hughes had discarded all of his clothes. He remained naked for months. Filth was now everywhere except on the telephone, which was his conduit to the world and to sanity. Every morning he took Kleenex and scrubbed the phone until tissues were strewn around him like dirty snow. On good days, it took an hour to clean the telephone. On bad days, 4 hours. No one was permitted to come within 4 feet of him. He would remain in the germ-free zone for the remainder of his life, no matter where he resided. Los Angeles, Las Vegas, London, Vancouver, the Bahamas, Nicaragua, Mexico. His life pattern was now fixed. The light of the sun, S-U-N, was blocked out. Clothes were largely banished. Television, movies, and the telephone were his only intruders. He became a disembodied voice on the phone, a sort of Wizard of Oz. And while he was doing that for 18 years, he made another fortune. And says the writer, Howard Hughes died of an illness called neglect. He left an estate worth an estimated $1 billion. Howard Hughes died of an illness called narcissism. Howard Hughes died of an illness called me first. And God can take a run and jump. Howard Hughes died of an illness because when he wakened in the morning troubled, he just rearranged his Hershey bars and refused, like Nebuchadnezzar before him, to lift his eyes to heaven. You say, well, you know, we've got Pharaoh in Egypt, we've got Howard Hughes in Hollywood, but we're in Cleveland and, you know. Are you telling me you don't wake up troubled? You see, the issue is not the zeros. The issue is not the place. The issue is this. We are all in the same predicament. Well, just one last phrase, huh? So Pharaoh sent for Joseph. Verse 14, Pharaoh sent for Joseph. When circumstances are happy and prosperous, men and women have little interest in sending for someone who will help them. And even when the circumstances are bad, if they feel that they don't like the kind of help they're being offered, they're likely to become enraged. That's what you've got in the story of Naaman. Remember, Naaman wakes up and he's got leprosy. We servant girl in the house says, I've got a good idea. If you go and see the servant of God at his house, I think he can take care of you. So he humbles himself enough to get his legion of chariots put together and goes to the guy's house. You know the story in 2 Kings 5. One of the servants goes in and says to Elisha, there's a fellow out here called Naaman. He's got a big string of limousines at the front door. He's got leprosy and he wants to know what to do. Elisha, who's having his cornflakes, looks up and says, tell him to go and dip himself in the Jordan 7 times. You'd like to have had that message to take back to the front door? So the guy comes out and he says, excuse me, the word from the servant of God is, go dip yourself in the Jordan 7 times. Now, I know I have leprosy, he says. And I know I want it fixed. But I'll go to hell before I get fixed that way. And the answer is, that is exactly where you'll go. And as he drives his limousines off in a rage, one of his servants says to him, Naaman, if the chap had asked you to do something really difficult, you'd have done it. But he only asked you to dip yourself in the Jordan 7 times. And for a second time responding to the word of a servant, he turns around and he goes and he does what Elisha said. It pains me more than I can say to look into the eyes with regularity of the affluent and the well-heeled, to find that in many a life there is the preparedness to admit, yes, I need to be cleansed. And then to watch as you continue to turn your heels and walk out into your own proud empires. Because you will not bow your knee to Jesus Christ. You're prepared to come. You're prepared to be religious. You're prepared to give. And that is wonderful. But it does not save. What are you going to do? Go back to your magicians? And so he sent for this young man and he said, I hear that you're good at dreams. And goodness, he wouldn't have been expecting the response, because Joseph says to him, I'm sorry, I can't do it. What? You can't do it? They told me you can do it. They told me, Joseph, you're my main man. No, says Joseph, I can't do it. But God can do it. And in this simple juxtaposition is the nature of all genuine Christian service. Indeed, is the nature of all spiritual life. Would you like to be saved? To know that your sins are forgiven, that heaven is your home, that your destiny is not lostness in hell? You know what you have to say? I cannot do it. I cannot work my soul to save. I cannot make myself righteous enough. I can't tip the scales in my favor. I can't do it. Well, if that was the end, it would be a miserable existence for us all, but it isn't. The answer is, that's absolutely right. You can't do it. But there is one who has done it. And in acknowledging my can't, and His can, I may be brought from darkness into life. And then, having been brought to faith, that I would live to serve Him. Now, could you help us in this way? Oh, I've never done that. I can't do it. That's good. That's the starting point. But God can. I can do all things through Christ, who strengthens me. This morning, as we take our leave of one another, especially if we go to serve God in any capacity at all, let us take a leaf from Joseph's biography, so that in our dungeon days and in our monotony and in our routines, we may learn still to trust in God. And in our moments of great opportunity, when people might be tempted to look to us, that we might be lost sight of, so that they may in turn look to God alone. For He is the only one who can deal with the troubled mind, the broken heart, and the rebellious spirit. Today, if you hear God's voice, do not harden your heart.
A challenging message from Alistair Begg and Truth for Life. We'll hear a closing prayer from Alistair in just a minute, so please keep listening. As Alistair described Joseph's time in the dungeon, maybe your heart resonated with his story. Maybe you feel like you're in a dungeon, or your heart is breaking under the weight of frightening circumstances, or the loss of a loved one. Maybe you're in the midst of a financial crisis, or you've been betrayed by a dear friend. These kinds of trials can easily overwhelm us and cause us to question God's goodness. So how do we continue trusting Him when everything seems to be falling apart? Alistair tackles that subject in a classic book he's written called The Hand of God. This book parallels our current series, drawing from the life of Joseph, and the book assures us that despite appearances, God is in control. He is working for the good of those who love Him. This book has been recently revised and updated. We'd love to get a copy in your hands, and we'll do that when you donate to support this ministry. But tomorrow is the last day the book will be available, so be sure to get your copy today. Ask for The Hand of God by Alistair Begg when you support Truth for Life with a financial gift today. Call 888-588-7884 or request the book when you give online at truthforlife.org. While you're on our website, be sure to take some time to browse through the extensive online sermon archive. Every message is available to stream free of charge, and these messages can be downloaded or shared with friends. You also have the option of requesting our current study on CD at our low cost without any markup. In case you missed it, our web address again is truthforlife.org. Now, before we conclude, here's Alistair with a final prayer.
And now, Father, you have seen into our lives and heard our words. May the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. And may grace, mercy, and peace from Father, Son, and Holy Spirit rest upon and remain with all who believe, today and forevermore. Amen.
I'm Bob Lepine, hoping you'll join us again Thursday as Alistair continues Joseph's story. He'll remind us that even when trouble is on the horizon, we don't need to fear because God is in control. The Bible teaching of Alistair Begg is furnished by Truth for Life, where the learning is for living.